Namaste, everyone. Welcome back to our very second podcast as part of this new initiative. You're here with Vedant, which is myself, and here with Shriram as well. So, namaste, everyone, and thank you for rejoining us for our second podcast here today. So, we have a very exciting topic planned today around the yamas and the niyamas. And so, we have a lot to unpack with this different sets of the different sets of Ashtanga Yoga. And so we'll go ahead and start into that in just a moment. But before that, wanted to quickly recap the podcast and just sense of what exactly we're trying to do here. So we're aiming to have these different 30 to 45-minute episodes where we discuss key concepts within yoga philosophy. And the goal, like we mentioned last time, isn't to just give these textbook lectures on a topic, but rather to explore the topic in an accessible way and focus on what the real world applications are of these different topics as applied to modern life. And so we're going to be doing this podcast once again in a Q&A format with several pre-prepared questions and discussion points, but we'll let the conversation run its course and we may have a lot of interesting avenues to explore based on the different frameworks and questions we bring up. So all of this content will be uploaded to the EkaShri website to start building a repository and knowledge base that anyone can access in order to hear more about these specific topics. And to the extent you do have any questions, you have any suggestions on topics that you would like to cover, we welcome you to email us at info@ekashri.yoga and let us know, and we will definitely try to make our best effort to rope these different topics and questions into our future discussions. So with that, we'll go ahead and delve into our topic for today, which is going to be the yamas and the niyamas. So as some of you may recollect, in our first discussion last week, we talked about Ashtanga Yoga, and we talked about holistically what exactly Ashtanga Yoga was and what exactly we mean by the different 8 limbs composed within Ashtanga Yoga. So the goal today is to touch upon these first 2 limbs, the yamas and the niyamas. So I guess to start, Shriramji, at its core, what does the concept of yama actually mean? So I know we've heard this term quite a bit and in various different contexts, but what do the yamas as a broader concept actually mean?
So the word yama actually comes from the root word yam. In Sanskrit, the root word, when we consult the dhatu pata, which is the compilation of all the verb roots of Sanskrit. So yam literally means to control. So how we control ourselves when we interact with the outer world, that's what yama concerns itself with. In other words, when we interact with outside, interact with people, interact with nature, interact with objects, events, situations, etc., then how can we bring harmony? How do we regulate ourselves, control ourselves in that interaction? And taking a step back, these 2 limbs, yamas and niyamas, are very important because oftentimes they are regarded as the forgotten limbs of yoga. Because yoga practitioners, they're very keen to jump into the yoga mat and begin the practice of asanas and pranayama, where perhaps all the spotlight is shining on the action part. Whereas the yamas and niyamas are equally important. They are important angas of the 8 limbs of Ashtanga Yoga. And the foundation of yamas and niyamas is very important because when we gain the benefits of the yoga practices, it should be founded on values and virtues, because for example, clarity of mind and a sharp intellect, when it is misused because of deceit or because somebody has some bad intentions, then it can be more damage can be done. So yamas and niyamas give that foundation for the practice of yoga. And most importantly, yamas and niyamas also benefit the practitioner most importantly. So not just the way not to harm others, but it also is a way to protect themselves as well. Because when somebody harbors an angry thought, for example, first of all, they are injuring themselves. So these are all some of the ideas around yamas and niyamas. So niyama also, interestingly, it is based on the same verb root, yam, to control, and the prefix ni, In Sanskrit, it's called the upasarga. The upasarga, the prefix ni, stands for nitaram. Nitaram means constant, eternal. So we practice these niyamas or regulation, how we regulate ourselves, keeping a clean surroundings, etc. And we'll come to it when we discuss the different parts of the yamas and niyamas.
Definitely, and that's a very helpful explanation, especially on the root, like etymology of the word. So very interesting to hear about the foundational concept for both the yamas and the niyamas. So before we delve into the specifics of what is comprised within each of the yamas and the niyamas, you mentioned an interesting point, Shriramji, right? Where basically a lot of yoga practitioners will jump, as we see today, right, into the asana section and, and maybe the meditation, the pranayama side after that. And I know last week we discussed how this is not sort of, the limbs are not necessarily a progression into, you need the first one to go to the second one to then go to the third one, and they rather operate together and like are different pieces of a puzzle that fit together. But I'm just curious if, if the very in advance, the novice practitioner sees the first step into yoga practice as the asanas and pranayama perhaps after that, why are the yamas and niyamas considered the first and the second steps in how we just literally define Ashtanga Yoga? Like, why is that? Why wouldn't it instead be maybe asanas first, pranayama second, and then the yamas and the niyamas? Because I think the asana, like you said, that's the most direct, accessible way to get into the yamas, to get into yoga and Ashtanga Yoga more broadly. So why do we mention these two topics first as opposed to asanas and pranayamas, which you would think are more accessible to the novice person beginning?
That's an interesting question, Vedantji. You are right. These angas, these 8 limbs, they have a parallel or a simultaneous growth. The progress that we make in one of the limbs, it helps in all the other limbs as well. And having said that, the way in which Patanjali has organized these 8 limbs of yoga has a very specific order, not in terms of the order in which we do the practice, but in terms of how he has organized them. It flows from outside to the inside. So the outermost practice, the yamas, is how we deal with the outside world, with others, with nature and stuff. So from the outside world, we come to the surroundings, keeping the surroundings clean, etc. That is the niyamas. And then the body, and then the physiological system, the prana, etc. And so we make our way gradually inwards. And the last 3 limbs, the dharana, dhyana, and samadhi, are called the antaranga sadhana or antaranga yoga. Trayam antarangam purvebhyaha is what Patanjali says. That means the last 3 limbs are internal practices as compared to the previous 5. So we see this progression of going from outside to the inside. That is how he has sequenced the 8 limbs of yoga.
I see. That's a very interesting gradient. I actually never thought about these different 8 limbs in that way, right? And so, but that makes a lot of sense because as we'll get into with the yamas and the niyamas, right? That's sort of your external facing, if you will, sort of aspects that you need to kind of that you take into account, right? So your interactions with the outside world. And then I guess asana is kind of on the border because obviously you still are there in the physical world and these are physical postures, but you're leading more towards yourself. And by the time you hit pranayama and go forward from there on, it's I think much more of an internal activity. So that's a very interesting sort of progression and just characterization, which I didn't think about Ashtanga Yoga and the limbs specifically in that way. So that's an interesting thing to keep in mind. So thanks for sharing that. And so with that, why don't we actually go into what are the yamas specifically, and what are the 5 yamas that we typically talk about?
So yamas are basically how we control ourselves when we interact with the outside world so that we promote harmony both in the environment as well as harmony within. That which promotes a harmonious interaction, we can think of it that way. And Patanjali in the Yoga Sutras, he enumerates 5 yamas or 5 controls, 5 knobs we can think of to control our interaction with the outside world. And they are, I will give the Sanskrit names first and then we will see what they are. Ahimsa, satya, Asteya, Brahmacharya, and Aparigraha. Ahimsa means non-violence. So himsa means violence, and ahimsa, which is the opposite of that, is non-violence. Uh, we can say being kind to everyone, being kind to others as well as to oneself, not harboring thoughts of hatred or not harboring thoughts of ill will, etc. So that is ahimsa.
And Shriramji, on ahimsa, real quick, can you elaborate a little bit more on that last point you just mentioned about being kind to yourself as well? So what does that actually mean, right? Because being kind in the external world, very simple concept, very straightforward. But what does it mean to be kind to yourself?
Because we include ourselves as part of the population of the planet. In other words, many times we make an exception. Okay, I'm being kind to everybody, but sometimes they're torturing themselves. Let me give an example. I have seen when doing yoga asanas in a yoga class, perhaps the practitioner wants to achieve a little bit more. So they have this ruthless determination. Perhaps they want to reach the final goal. They want to touch their toes in an asana. Then they don't mind going beyond or even far beyond the zone of comfort. And because they have their sight set on achieving the final posture, but on the way to that, they may not be very kind to their body. So that is an example of himsa, which is the we can think of it as the opposite of being non-violent. And so that is a place where being kind to oneself, be accepting the condition of the body as it is right now, being happy with it, and from a happy place, we are going to the next level of happiness. In other words, the growth happens from a place of contentment and happiness rather than from a place of I'm not okay with where I am and I want to achieve that, then I will be happy.
Interesting. So I didn't realize ahimsa, when you apply it to yourself, I would have thought just more definitionally, just by, if I take the very standard definition of nonviolence, it would have been like, for example, try not to do harm to yourself from a more, like the very stereotypical things you think about, physically harming yourself or this and that. I didn't realize from even an asana perspective, if you're going and pushing beyond your boundaries to the point where you're actually injuring yourself, that also would fall under the umbrella of himsa versus ahimsa. So that is a very interesting point, and I didn't realize that. But now looking back, when we think about, even as we teach, right, when we say, for example, if you're in a certain asana, you go to, right, Sthiram Sukham Asanam, you go to a fine point where you're comfortable in the final position that you can maintain. And the reason being that if you're any less, you're not stretching yourself enough. So you're not like reaching your full sort of potential in that final state, if you will. But if you go beyond that, it's actually self-injurious and harmful. So that's a very interesting point. I didn't know ahimsa covers that as well. So that's very interesting. And again, that ties back to another point that I think maybe broadly I should have mentioned before, but, we have the very literal definitions of all these different, yamas, and we'll get to the niyamas later, but there is so much more to think about from a subtlety and just a much more abstract perspective to each of these different subcomponents of the yamas, right? Where you think about, for example, like ahimsa here, right? Nonviolence, killing someone is a clear definitional, sort of the very little definition of what this word means, but doing no harm to yourself. And then within that, for example, not stretching beyond your means, there's just so much on a more subtle and a more sort of nuanced way to interpret these different items. So that's very interesting. So I'll let you get back. So we went off on a sidetrack here, but I think just very interesting to kind of think about how nuanced these different components are. And I think that's something that our audience will definitely, it'll be helpful to keep that in mind as we keep the conversation going.
In fact, you highlighted a very important point that ahimsa can be applied in so many situations. In other words, it is not just one little word, non-violence. It has so much depth of meaning. For example, non-violent with the body, non-violent with our speech, and non-violent with our thoughts. So there are so many dimensions to it.
Yeah, definitely. And so why don't I have a lot of questions that are formulating on the different, nuanced aspects of all of these different yamas. So why don't we quickly go ahead and just go through the other four, just so that we have, a foundation to deal with the yamas. And then we can from there go ahead and discuss a little bit more about the niches and the nuances within each of these different ideas.
So the first one is the ahimsa, And in fact, not just the Yoga Sutras, there are many texts that talk about ahimsa, the non-violence, as being one of the highest dharma. There's a saying, ahimsa paramo dharmaha. In other words, that is the highest virtue. Ahimsa is the highest virtue. And the second yama that Patanjali gives is satya. Satya literally means truth. Here also, there are so many different dimensions. What is truth? Is it just factually correct? What we say is factually true? There's much more than that. Living a life of integrity is what satyam is. And for example, Shankara defines satyam as trikale api tishtati iti sat. That means that which is constant across past, present, and future. That which is same, it is not changing. Truth does not change. In other words, it is what it is. It doesn't appear differently at different points of time. So going back to that truth, which is like an anchor point where we don't get swayed by the ups and downs, and we have a place of centeredness. So that is truth, being established in truth. And the third one is Asteya. Asteya literally means non-stealing, or not taking something that does not belong to us. Maybe it is in somebody else's possession. So we respect each person's what they have. We don't grab from outside that which does not belong to us. So that is Asteya. And of course, it also has different meanings. Being trustworthy is Asteya. For example, if somebody gives us an item to take care of it for a few days because they're going away somewhere, for example, then we take care of it faithfully without stealing, to put it bluntly. So that is Asteya, being trustworthy, non-stealing. And then Brahmacharya is the next one. Brahmacharya literally means moving in Brahman. That means moving in the highest. Now, it is also translated as celibacy, but that is just a very thin slice. It is only a very small dimension of what Brahmacharya is. Brahmacharya literally means seeing the bigness of whatever is our object of attention. For example, when we interact with people, respecting them, honoring them, another way to say it is seeing the divinity in them. You see, that's the definition of namaste, right? When we say namaste, perhaps we go to a yoga class and people greet each other as namaste. Namaha te literally means I respect you, which can be more broadly be stated as the divine in me sees the divine in you. So that is Brahmacharya. I see the bigness in you. I don't see the other person as an object that will fulfill my desire. It's like that. You see them for who they are and respect them, honor them, revere them, appreciate them. So that is Brahmacharya. And then the last yama is Aparigraha. Parigraha means to hoard or to accumulate. So it is an expression of greed. I want more and more. So people discovered that bringing one more trinket into their life, thinking that this will make me happy, soon we forget about it and then we bring the next item. So very soon the house becomes like a little museum, right? So many objects accumulated. And so that is parigraha. So a yogi follows a parigraha, which is the opposite of parigraha, which means non-accumulating, non-hoarding. And so these 5 are the yamas that Patanjali enumerates.
Wonderful. These are all really beautiful explanations for all of these different 5 yamas. And so there's a lot to unpack here, I think. And so I think we touched upon a couple of the initial topics, but ahimsa, I think, for the most part, I know there's so much to unpack there, but we've kind of, talked a little bit about it. And in the interest of time, I want to move on to the other 4 that we talked about. So on the concept of, satya, right? One interesting point that you mentioned, right, in this whole concept of telling the truth is, there's the question of, first of all, what is the true truth, right? You and I may not, what we see as the truth may be a very different thing than what each of us individually believes. And then the second thing is that as opposed to being a sort of binary concept, right? It's a gradient and it's a spectrum, right? As opposed to being something that's sort of yes or no. So when you think about satya, right? So how do you reconcile sort of what is, factual versus what you believe as being the truth? So which one is the truth, and are they all, or are they just, both forms of the same truth? Or how do you think about beliefs versus factual things as satya or truth more broadly?
In fact, interestingly, the texts talk about different levels of truth, three levels of truth. And so the first one is the personal truth. In other words, what is our perception in that moment? As they say, uh, the perception, the vantage point from which we see things is how we behold the scene or the scenery. You see, the perspective creates perception, it is said. Perspective creates perception. How we perceive it is from which vantage point from which we see. So that creates our personal experience. Somebody with a different perspective would see the same thing differently. In fact, in the Yoga Sutras, Patanjali makes this point. He says, Vastu samye chitta bhedas tayor vibhakta pantaha. In the sutra, he says, Vastu, an object, the same object that is perceived by different people, different chittas or different minds, they will experience it differently. It's like half empty, half full. Who is correct, right? So they describe it in their own words, the same scene. And so that is one level of truth, namely what we perceive. The second level of truth is the objective truth. In other words, we remove the subjective part of it, the perspective part of it, and you just make a note of the observations, like the evidence based. This is the evidence, and you put forth that statement in an objective manner. So, for example, if a doctor asks a patient, so when they take the record of their health and the history and so forth, do you smoke? If the doctor asks the patient, and if the patient says, oh, I don't smoke, the doctor will not record it as the patient does not smoke. They will just record it as the patient states that he or she does not smoke. You see the difference, right? So you just make a note of the objectively, what did they say? Whether it's true or not, we don't know. So we make an objective truth. What is it that was observed? What is it that was said? We make a note of that. And then the third level of truth is the universal truth or the highest truth, which is the fundamental truth of the universe. In fact, in Sanskrit, there's a word for that, which is called the rhythm, R-T-A-M, rhythm. And in fact, the English word rhythm comes from that. In other words, the heartbeat of the universe, the fundamental truth of the universe, the ultimate truth, the nature of the self. Who am I? What is the nature of the universe, etc. So this ultimate truth, that is the higher level truth. And that is what doesn't change with time. We mentioned about the definition of truth as that which is constant across the 3 periods of time. So the nature of the self, the nature of the universe, etc. So from that level of truth, we see, for example, some of the things that are very concerning to us in this moment are trivial. They need not worry our mind so much when we enter into this higher place of truth. So that is the value of living satyam. When we live in that place of truth, as they say, truth shall set you free. When we abide in truth, it relieves us of suffering. And yoga and its parent philosophy, Sankhya, has a lot to say on this. Sankhya actually says that when you see the world as it is, without any distortion, you see the truth as it is, then you'll be a free person. You'll be in samadhi. You'll be so blissful, is what it says.
So Shriramji, that makes a lot of sense, right? And obviously, telling the truth, it's a very simple concept, very elementary sort of concept. And in an ideal world, it all works out in a way where you feel personally liberated because you don't have to worry about, the different backstories and all that stuff, keeping up with all that, right? That creates a whole another saga to go with. It takes up mental capacity, etc. But are we really, I don't think every situation sort of leads itself to where speaking the truth is going to lead to positive events, right? I mean, that's the headline where obviously we want to do because we want to speak the truth because it's the right thing to do. But what if, you're in a situation where that telling the truth is going to be harmful to someone in some way, or is going to bring suffering or some kind of ill or some kind of difficulty to them, right? And so I'm not thinking of an example on the fly here, but there are situations, right, when, for example, you maybe tell someone, like, let's just say a patient, right, that, for example, they're dying of some particular illness or disease, but they maybe have a small chance to live. How do you gauge, should you tell the truth in those kind of situations versus maybe withholding information because it might do more harm to actually speak the full truth versus maybe sugarcoating it or withholding some information? So how do you think about situations where the actual blunt truth may be something difficult or something that could actually inflict more damage to someone, as opposed to the idealistic scenario where it's something that you feel purely liberated from and you feel satisfied with yourself because you did end up speaking the truth?
That's an excellent point, because saying the truth, speaking words of truth, does not mean speaking it bluntly without respecting the other's emotions or respecting the other person, how they will receive it. In the Bhagavad Gita, a guideline is given. There is a verse that says, Anudvega karam vakyam satyam priya hitam chayat. That means the truth should be communicated or conveyed with a loving manner, compassionate and loving expression of truth, which brings relief to the other, relief from suffering. If they are afraid or if they are going through a negative experience, our words should bring them comfort. Speak the truth, but express it in such a way that it uplifts them, it relieves them of their uh, suffering or misery. So, this is an art. How we can do that is up to us, and it is an art how we uh, live that life of telling the truth and telling it with compassion and love. So, an example is given, I think, that illustrates your point when there's a conflict between telling the truth and being kind to the other person. So, for example, if there's a conflict between ahimsa and satya, a classic example that is quoted is so this is a story about a deer comes running to the ashram of a great rishi, a sage, and the deer says, "Oh, there's a hunter that is trying to kill me. So please protect me in your ashram." And the sage says, "Okay, please come, please go inside. I will talk to the hunter." And then the hunter comes and says, "Is there a deer here?" And so you can imagine the predicament of the rishi, right? If he tells the truth, then he is not following ahimsa, because the hunter will find the deer and kill it. So if he has to follow ahimsa, then perhaps he may have to utter a lie. So how to manage this situation? And this is something to contemplate on. There is no ready-made answer. It's not like in each situation, either this or that will win. It's not like that at all. We can come up with ideas. It's something to brainstorm and think about and contemplate upon how to handle such a situation. But the guideline from the Bhagavad Gita verse that we just saw is speaking the truth. At the same time, the truth should also bring relief. In other words, it should not injure others. So, what is the best way to make that happen? And it's up to us to find out what is the way. Sometimes we find ourselves in predicament like this, where we have to do either this or that. They say uh, that deciding between the sea and a hard place or something like that. So, which choice do we make? We have to think about it, and that's where keeping the mind clear. So when you practice yoga, when there is clarity of mind, we have access to intuition and creativity, and new ideas will come up where we can honor both the yamas. Satya and ahimsa can both be expressed. Some creative way to handle this problem, this idea will come up in that moment.
No, and I think that's a very interesting point, Shriram. Your audience will hopefully appreciate. It's a very nuanced subject, but the way you put it, right? How communicating the truth is an art, right? It's not a science, it's an art. And I think there's a lot of meaning to that, just because, like you mentioned, you'll probably be in situations where there's a dichotomy where, like you mentioned, right, doing no harm, right, ahimsa versus himsa, versus telling the truth versus not telling the truth. And that's a contradiction that I'm sure many people, including people in the audience, have probably found themselves in, no matter what degree or what scale of issues that, that situation presents itself in. So it's very interesting to know that the scriptures, and I think the philosophy more broadly, puts forward that it's an art to be able to communicate these things. And so probably half the battle itself is not just telling the truth, but the other half is also the communication, and how do you think about putting it in a way where you still deliver the full message of the truth, and you don't actually shy away from the core message you're trying to impart. And so that's an interesting way, and an interesting topic that I think is just something, food for thought for us to think about internally a little bit more. And, like you said, the way I think about it too is also, it's a question of how, how much longer do you sort of kick the can down the road, right? As opposed to ripping off the Band-Aid now, where, you have that short-term, damage up front. Maybe damage is not even the best word to use, but you have that short-term impact up front, but then, okay, people know, right? The scare is sort of gone because now people have the full information. Whereas just if you roll that and let that snowball down the road without telling the truth, down the line, the consequences of that could be much more impactful and much more severe versus if you were to do it now. So I think that the question also becomes, as your role as the person who's telling the truth, you have a decision to make, right? Where, if that, for example, telling the truth in, some particular context is going to do, it is going to have some sort of negative impact, through no fault of your own, it's a decision, should you just tell that truth up front now? Because then, okay, at least down the line, you're actually preventing more damage from kind of snowballing and compounding by telling the truth now versus not telling the truth and letting that, compound later on. So I think just, broadly food for thought, and something that's very interesting to consider, just because, like we said before, right, this is such a spectrum. It's nothing like there's a binary decision about telling the truth versus not telling the truth. And, all the more reason why there's so much to unpack and really think about behind these different yamas and the niyamas. So that's very interesting. So I think we've hopefully done justice to this concept of satya. And I mean, there's still a lot more to cover, but yeah.
Let me add a couple of points to that.
Yes.
So interestingly, Patanjali, his recommendation to follow the yamas is he doesn't give any leeway for us to wiggle out of it. He says they should be practiced universally. He says, Jati Desha Kala Samayanavachina Sarvabhauma Mahavratam. That means Mahavratam means great vows, VOW, vow. So they are all great disciplines that have to be followed regardless of the situation, place, time, etc. So he is very blunt about that, you could say. In other words, don't make any exceptions to it. And the way my teacher used to explain it is, so if you have a tire, a small hole in the tire will make the whole thing go flat. So even if it is one tiny hole, then the whole system collapses. So like that, if you make a single exception, okay, I'm going to be truthful to everybody except this one person. If you make an exception like that, then the whole edifice will simply shatter, it will break apart. So no exception should be made, is what Patanjali says. And another thing to note about this topic of satya is, usually people, when they say they are going to finally tell their truth, they talk about what is called confession, right? I'm going to confess my truth. But the way in which it is presented in the yamas is expressing truth not as a confession, but as a celebration. You see the difference? I am uttering the truth. I am expressing the truth because I wish to live in that place of truth, integrity, honesty, etc. So we celebrate that space. It's not because I'm confessing. There's a difference in these two perspectives. So um, this is another subtle point that I thought we should mention here.
So I guess the way I interpret that is, one is sort of a much more passive thing, perhaps, where, for example, you've tried as much as you can to prevent yourself from telling the truth, seeing if you can sort of get away with it. And then only as a last resort, when you realize, okay, all your paths are closed and you've been basically caught, that's when the truth comes out. Whereas the delineation between that and the second one is, right from the get-go, you want to live, like you mentioned, in that environment of integrity, honor, and truthfulness. And so the truth is the first thing that comes out of your mouth because you believe that it's important to your environment and to you yourself from a principle perspective to just make sure that you're, being honest and truthful and living to your full potential in that way. And so that's another very interesting point you bring up. So and I guess that has to do on the concept of intentions as well, right? So that's basically what it stems from. And so that's another very interesting point to mention here in Satya. And I think, like you mentioned, there's, once again, I think this just goes back to the whole point about everything being such a gradient and a spectrum, right? So there's so many ways to interpret the truth. What is the truth? Why should we speak the truth? And then when should we speak the truth, right? Which I guess ties back to this very last point we just brought up. So I think that's a very interesting, a lot of nuances behind the whole concept of Satya. And I think, when I first saw this, it's very easy to think about this on a very stereotypical definition perspective where it's truth, not the truth. How hard is this, right? But when you unpack this and just go deeper and deeper, you realize that there's just so much here to really discover and so much to really think about. And different situations, different contexts put you in different sort of states of mind, to the point where telling the truth versus not telling the truth becomes a much more meaningful question, and I think a much more nuanced question. So it's just very important, I think, to our audience and me myself as well, to just understand, we always do want to speak the truth, of course, but then how do we think about when in the mind a thought flashes about, okay, maybe not this time because it doesn't make sense to tell the truth? How do you think about reconciling that, within yourself, in order to make sure that you're still living by the principles of Satya, but at the same time you're doing it in a way where you benefit from telling the truth, and more than that, you intellectually understand why you're benefiting and why you're speaking the truth, as opposed to just sort of going on autopilot. So I think a lot of words to explain a nuanced concept, and it's probably hard to put it in words. So that's why we're struggling to find words here. But I think that's a very comprehensive explanation of Satya. And so anything else to add there, Shriramji? Otherwise, we'll move on to the other yamas, where we have a lot more way to go.
Yeah, I guess what Patanjali is trying to help us with is, by practicing these values, we are actually benefiting ourselves. It is helpful. Sometimes people say, I want you to tell me the truth because I don't want to be deceived. But what Patanjali is saying is, I want you to be truthful because otherwise you will injure yourself. So you see that the subtle difference there.
So yeah, so essentially you're looking at it a way where you benefit as well, right? So it's not just about another person, another individual who benefits from you speaking the truth, but it's rather yourself as well, right? Where
Exactly.
So that's a very interesting concept I didn't realize before, because I would have always thought this concept of telling the truth is very external focused, right? Where you don't want to, obviously telling the truth, there's different people have different levels of how they feel about telling the truth and when and why they should speak the truth. But I didn't realize that Patanjali put forward that it's also something that's self-beneficial to speak the truth. So that's a very interesting perspective, where it's mutually beneficial both for the other party and for yourself to be speaking the truth. So hopefully that encourages, that's something that I'll keep in mind going forward. And hopefully for our audience, that encourages people to, always, as much as possible, stick to the principle of truth, because there is some positive benefits, to it for yourself. So very interesting. So I know we can have a whole discussion about Satya, and we can probably speak at this, much more in length, maybe at a later session, but wanted to briefly touch upon a couple of the other yamas that we spoke about and that you had so nicely defined. So Asteya, I think for me personally, this is one of the, I don't want to use the word easier, but it's a little bit more straightforward, I think, to answer compared to some of the other yamas, right? Where you mentioned non-stealing, but also being trustworthy, right? Where if I give you something to guard while I'm away, right? For example, or I put something in your possession with the hopes that you will take care of it, you return the favor and you abide by that by not, pilfering or stealing something while I'm not looking or trying to damage what I'm, giving you to basically safeguard and protect. So that's a very interesting concept. I think obviously those two go hand in hand. So it's not only the active job of not going out to a store, for example, and trying to steal something, but also the more inactive job and more sort of indirect role of being a good steward of guarding something that has been entrusted to your position. So I think we'll leave Asteya there unless you have something more subtle to bring up, which our audience would benefit from knowing that isn't readily apparent in the pure definition of the word.
I think you have very beautifully articulated, Vedanji. One thing I'll just briefly add, just like, for example, when we spoke about ahimsa, we saw that there is a physical ahimsa, ahimsa of the body, ahimsa of with the words, and ahimsa with the mind, the thoughts that we encourage in our mind. Like that, we can have the same principles apply to asteya as well. So, steya or stealing is not just stealing a physical object. So not taking credit for somebody else's good work that they did is another example, you see. And also, even if the physical act of stealing does not take place, even the mental thought of, oh, I wish I had what they have. Maybe it could be a talent or it could be some possession of theirs. I wish I had that. That is also a thought which goes against asteya, you see.
So can we unpack that a little bit more? I think at this point for our audience, we're probably not going to be able to hit the niyamas today just because there's so much to unpack here. But can we delve into that concept a little bit further, right? So again, and the reason why I ask is because once again, right, asteya, non-stealing, literally very simple to interpret, right? It's not rocket science to know that you should not be stealing something from someone else. And obviously, like we mentioned about, when you're a steward of property, right, you take care of it, honorably and properly. But that concept of even mentally, you shouldn't be having those thoughts. So, it's only natural, right, Shriramji, when you're, human beings, right? These feelings of jealousy, envy, wishing I had, like you mentioned, a talent, or wishing I had that big house or that boat or whatever it is. Even though you may not physically or outwardly, express those thoughts, but even mentally, I understand that it makes sense that this falls under the principle of asteya, but how do you bring that together with human nature, which is naturally to have these feelings of envy, jealousy, etc. So how do you even think about sort of bridging the two, and how should we even think about that concept as a whole?
I'm sure you see this shade of difference, right? So we could be inspired. For example, somebody has attained some level of success, perhaps in their profession. To give an example, oh, I'm inspired by them. So they're my role model. So that can give a positive place. There's no stealing involved in that. You see, even at the level of the mind, they are just evoking the best from us. So that is not going against asteya. Whereas going against asteya would mean that they have something in their possession and I want it and I'm unhappy about it. So it doesn't invoke the best from within, it invokes the opposite. It is the result of what they have achieved we want in our possession. So that is the difference here.
And again, and I think another way to spin it is that one is a very sort of positive internal force. The other one is sort of a more self-destructive, negative internal force, right? So on the positive side, like you mentioned, right, where if you have someone, even if it's a peer, same level in all, set of qualifications, this and that, but you see the work that they're doing, you get inspired by it, that pushes you to push yourself to your limits and expand your limits. That inherently is a very positive force. Whereas the other one is sort of, if it's more envy, jealousy, right? That's sort of a self-destructive set of thoughts which then leads to this perpetual negative feedback loop, right? And that then lets you spiral downwards. And ultimately, it goes back to the concept of, you're hurting yourself at the end of the day, as opposed to helping yourself. So that's a very interesting nuance with Asteya that I never thought of before. And so,
in fact, you mentioned about this perpetual cycle of going into this negativity. Patanjali makes a very similar statement. So he says, whenever the thought of going against these yamas and niyamas arise in the mind, say a thought that says, I want to express hatred, which goes against ahimsa, or some thought that goes against asteya. If that thought enters the mind, Patanjali says, remind yourself of the consequence of doing that. If that thought is encouraged and acted upon, then it will lead to an endless chain, a perpetual cycle of more and more negative consequences that will only result in misery. So don't do that, is what Patanjali says. And later on, we will see, maybe in the next week's session, what are some of the guidelines that he gives to handle the thought in the mind that goes away from these yamas and niyamas. We will look at it after we cover all these yamas and niyamas.
That was exactly what my next question was going to be, which is, practically, how do we think about actually dealing with those thoughts when they come into our minds? And so I think, like you mentioned, right, to do justice to that topic, we can't have this conversation in 30 seconds because there's so much more to actually think about and internalize with that. So we'll definitely table that, but I think that's something that, our audience and, me, myself, and very interested in understanding, because it's just natural to be human, right? And to have these kinds of thoughts. So I'm very curious how we actually think about practically applying the principles that Patanjali has put forth to actually make use of what we're discussing here in the yamas and actually deal with these topics and these feelings. So we'll table that for another day, but I think it's an incredibly important sort of complement to this conversation, which we definitely should talk about, hopefully after we go through the niyamas. And so we'll definitely bring that up as a topic going forward in the next couple of sessions. So I know we're running short on time, so I want to jump to Brahmacharya here, which I think, is another very subtle topic. There's a lot to actually think about and unpack here as well. So Brahmacharya, when you think about it, and when I had first heard the term and first read about it, I think celibacy is the very literal definition that comes to mind when we think about Brahmacharya, right? And so one question, I personally have is Brahmacharya. So that concept of celibacy seems to imply that you're sort of on this one extreme where you can think about it not so much, literally as people retreating into the forest, like sages, and sort of renouncing everything from the world and renouncing all the worldly sensual pleasures and other physical pleasures that, you may have in the world. But how does this concept of Brahmacharya kind of dovetail with the concept of moderation, right? So one thing about yoga and just yoga philosophy more broadly is this concept of moderation, where it's okay to have exposure to various different pleasures in life as long as it's done with moderation and it doesn't lead to habits, addiction, or any kind of negative consequences down the line. So how do we think about reconciling this concept of Brahmacharya with this concept of moderation?
So in fact, the literal meaning of Brahmacharya is to move in the highest, to live our life in the highest. Brahmani charati iti Brahmacharya. That means in the Brahman, in the highest, we live our life, we conduct our life. And the celibacy is a part of it. But the idea here is that the joy that we are seeking is the highest joy, not something that is a trivial joy that has a limited scope in time. It has a beginning and an end. In Bhagavad Gita gives a lot of clarity on this. It says, Param drishtva nivartati. That means when you have a taste of the higher joy, then your attachment or hankering for trivial types of joy will simply wither away. And um, an example or a metaphor that is given is when the sun is shining bright, you don't need the use of a candle. You don't need a candle there. Like that, when you have tasted the highest joy, the joy of the Brahman, then the little pleasures the fleeting pleasures that come through the contact of the physical senses with the sense objects, the yogi discovers that it's a fraction of the joy that comes from abiding in oneself.
So does that, and that's very beautifully put. And I think there's a lot to, again, kind of think about and internalize there. But when you have that sense of this more divine aspect, right? And you know what this sort of ultimate state of happiness and pleasure is, does that mean that you don't engage in the more physical pleasures, sensual pleasures, because you know that this higher happiness is there? Or does it mean that you still engage in it, but you know that it won't lead to any kind of, habitual negative thing or some kind of addiction, because you know that there is a higher level of being? So I don't know if those two concepts are necessarily two distinct things, or whether they're, intertwined together. But I'm just curious. So if, someone has truly mastered Brahmacharya, or has really understood what that concept is, does that mean that they will still engage in those kind of activities, or will they not altogether?
It's an interesting thing. So when we look at some of the great yogis in the last 200 years, so when we look at, say, T. Krishnamacharya, who is regarded as the father of modern yoga, so he was a householder. He didn't run as a recluse, and so he had a family, and so he engaged in life in the society as normal. Like that, Paramahamsa Yogananda's teacher's teacher, Lahari Mahashaya, was also a householder, and he was a great yogi. Now, when we read the Bhagavad Gita, it throws a lot of clarity in the point that yogis need not run away and become a recluse. In fact, even the daily activities, what we call routine or mundane activities, like folding clothes or washing dishes, to give an example, they can be spiritualized. They might appear trivial actions, but when we change our perspective on why we are doing that, we can actually spiritually charge those actions. In other words, Bhagavad Gita gives us a recipe of how to transform even simple activities and uplift them to the level of a prayer, to the level of a spiritual practice. We engage the spirit in even these small actions. So the point that I'm making here is that we need not run away. We can be engaged in this world. The thing that Patanjali makes clear, so when we talk about, he uses the word called vairagya. Vairagya means the understanding that the joy, the ultimate joy that I'm seeking, cannot be brought to me by the body. It cannot be brought to me by the sense making contact with the sense objects. This is one level of understanding, vairagya. And then he makes one further statement. He calls Parama Vairagya. Parama Vairagya means the highest dispassion, where the yogi has realized the highest happiness and knows once and for all that this happiness is unmatched by whatever the body can supply to me. So this is a long-winded answer to come back, circle back to where we started. We don't need to be a recluse and avoid these activities. It is the understanding that the true joy that I'm seeking, the yogi is after the highest joy and samadhi. So that samadhi experience, it cannot be had by any means through the body, because the body is still in the realm of what is called the prakriti. So that is the understanding that helps the yogi live in the place of brahmacharya.
Got it. So for our audience, then, if I were to recap in one line, right? So what it seems to come down to in what I'm hearing is that you basically intellectually understand that sensual pleasures are not the ultimate state of being, right? There's so much more beyond that. And so that recognition is then what allows you to basically conquer those physical pleasures, the very worldly pleasures that you may typically associate with happiness at the most materialistic or the most sensual level. And so it's that understanding of that higher state of happiness, right? Where you brought up this word, dispassion, right? Where you have that dispassion, that detachment, you're able to live basically liberated, for a lack of a better way to put it. It's that idea and understanding that that idea is there that allows you to basically, that is your liberation from all these sensual and physical pleasures. And that's what keeps you kind of able to basically stay in the physical world where you live. You don't have to run off to the forest like, we discussed, but that's basically that mental thought that keeps you in that state of liberation, even when you're in, the physical human world, as we all
Yes.
are.
So to add one more thing to that, we are not trying to conquer it or to vanquish that thought. It is like when we look back on our life, as we were growing up, as babies, maybe we had a lot of toys, and our thought was that those friends who have more toys, maybe they're more happy. But then when we grow up, we are no longer attached to all those toys and teddy bears, and I hope, right? So we graduate out of it. Now our focus is on other things. So a yogi, when they make this progress in the path of yoga, same thing happens. So the definition of what is joy? Is joy just consuming more and more delicious food, or is there some higher joy than that? In fact, in the Taittiriya Upanishad, an analysis of happiness is given. Suppose 1 unit of happiness is when all your desires are fulfilled. If some deva comes here and says, okay, give me a list of all the desires, I'll fulfill all those desires in this one moment. And you can imagine they'll feel happy, right? There'll be some amount of happiness. If you take that to be 1 unit of happiness, and the Upanishad says the human nervous system or the human mind is capable of orders of magnitude more happiness. It has the potential to experience much more happiness, orders of magnitude more. And it lists what are the ways in which this happiness can be experienced. So, anyway, that's a topic for a different time. But the point is, the sake of Brahmacharya. Brahmacharya is Brahman, Brihat. The word Brahman comes from Brihat, which means the biggest. So we are after the highest happiness. That's what it means. And let me give a very practical example of how we can live that Brahmacharya. For example, as students, say we are entering our new semester, and usually as the semester starts, people have very good intentions. Oh, I will be very diligent in my academics. I will excel in what I do. Or during the New Year's resolution, this year I'll be a different person. I will exercise every day. So all these very great intent, very high intentions are there in the mind. But as the year progresses or as the semester progresses, we dump down our determination, right? Maybe the determination is not as strong. So Brahmacharya means have the highest vision all the time. Live in that highest vision all the time. You see?
Yeah, no, that's very interesting. And I think and that's something that we all have to work towards. I know, like, exactly what you said to the last point about it's very easy to mentally idealize living in that highest vision or trying to live by those highest principles, right? But then actually going through it is something that's an entirely different story, right? And that, I think, is where, I think it would make so much sense for us to have a whole separate session on just the practical utility of how to actually think about that and what practices, what, different imagery, what kind of things should we even think about in order to make these idealistic situations, these ideal thoughts into realities. So that's something that I think we should definitely touch upon in a future session, just to get a sense of what we can actually apply and what toolkits and instruments we have at our disposal through yoga and yoga philosophy more broadly to actually make these things a part of our daily lives. So why don't we quickly touch upon Aparigraha before we conclude today, because, had a lot of questions planned, but obviously when we talk about these different concepts and the yamas specifically, there's so much to actually think about and talk about here. So Aparigraha, I think, is also one of those where probably a little bit more straightforward, I would hope. But again, there's still, so many nuances, even in the most simple of these topics that, there might be much more. But Aparigraha, like you mentioned, it's non-hoarding, non-accumulation. And I think that that really ties back to the whole principle of moderation, right? And I think a lot of things that, human nature, when you think about, right, when we see this whole word free, or we see something that's on sale, or we see something that's just, the economic rationale would be to take as much of it as you possibly can, because why not? It's free, right? For example. But it's interesting how, when we operate economically, we would think very differently from how we would operate if we were to operate with these principles of the yamas. So when we think about Aparigraha, how should we think about, practically applying this whole concept of non-hoarding and non-accumulation when, natural human behavior would tell us to do the opposite?
So here, the connection between accumulating objects or accumulating anything, accumulating experiences or events or trophies or certificates or whatever, acquiring more and more stuff, because we associate in our mind that my happiness comes from there. So to give an example, if I eat one apple pie, I get X amount of happiness, and perhaps the mind makes this calculation. If I consume two apple pies, I'll be twice as happy. And extrapolate it even further. If I eat 100 apple pie, then perhaps I'll be 100 times more happy. Of course, it doesn't happen, right? The more we gorge and devour more and more, there comes a point where accumulating or consuming too much it goes against happiness. In fact, we feel miserable after that. So accumulating stuff does not help with gaining more and more happiness. So this understanding helps the yogi to live a life of aparigraha. That means I'm not going to hoard it, because it will just simply sit there and it is not elevating the state of my being anyways. It's not making me happy or not anybody else happy. So this understanding itself will promote this behavior of this attitude and this practice of aparigraha.
And is that something that you think, it's one thing to be able to, and I know we'll have a different session on more the practical aspects of how do we actually think about applying these concepts in principle, but is, to reach that state of, intellectually understanding that each incremental trinket, like you put it right before, that you bring to the house has a much lower marginal benefit, if you will, in terms of economic terms, right, than maybe the first one or second one you brought. So in order to understand this concept of aparigraha, is that something that you kind of have to go through this whole process of accumulating as much as you can to realize that, okay, I've accumulated all this junk in the house, and now it doesn't bring me any happiness, or is there a way to maybe circumvent that and understand upfront that, okay, each marginal thing, maybe isn't going to help me as much? And so the reason why I say that is because I think, just going back to human nature, which we've brought up on this discussion so many times, right? It's natural for us to want to, if something is, we think is, free or cheap, it's natural for us to kind of want to hoard as much as we can. So I'm just curious, Shriramji, what your thoughts are on that, and whether it's something we kind of have to go through and experience to realize that, oh, maybe this doesn't actually make me that happy.
In fact, this can be a trap, right? Okay, let me find out for myself that accumulating stuff is not going to bring me benefit. Let me try it out. And if we go on that path, then perhaps we might get sucked into that vortex. And, it's an endless cycle that happens. So it's interesting that all the 5 yamas are actually the natural way of living of a person who's established in yoga. In other words, a person, we could say a perfected one, or a person with a very clear mind, they will live all these values naturally. And what we are trying to do is that use them as a role model. How do they behave? How do they talk? Do they tell the truth, etc.? And then we identify what are the ways in which they are expressing themselves in life, and we are trying to follow that. You see, there's a saying that says the the siddhi of a siddha becomes the sadhana of the sadhaka. The siddhi of the siddha becomes the sadhana of the sadhaka. That means what comes naturally for a ideal person, perhaps your role model or a yogi who is already very adept in yoga. What values they live becomes the practice for uh, yogis who are just making their first steps, you see. And what we discover is that all these yamas and niyamas come naturally to one who is already their adept yogis. It's second nature
And
for them.
And that's a very interesting point, because I would have thought it's the opposite, where the natural human nature is to do the exact opposite, right? All these feelings that are basically the opposite of what all these yamas prescribe is what, because, and the reason I think that is because the whole point, right? I mean, within Hindu philosophy more broadly, we have this whole like cycle of reincarnation. And the reason why you're here on earth is because you have some karma from your past life that, wasn't the most positive thing. And so it's very interesting to know that there's this dichotomy where when we think about the true yogi state, it's one that's in full alignment with all the principles of the yamas. But when you think about the average human nature, it's one that's very misaligned with all of these different principles that are put forth within the concept of yama more broadly, right? And so it seems like, through the practical aspects, which we'll get into in another session, we're trying to take our natural human tendency and human behavior and get that more aligned and closer to what the yamas and the yogic style of living basically emphasizes and basically prescribes. So that, I would say, is probably my key takeaway from what we've discussed today. And so I know we've gone on for quite a bit. And so I think we definitely will not be able to hit the niyamas today, because there's, again, equally amount, if not more, to unpack there. And I think that also lends itself to a lot more of a sort of more crystallized and concrete discussion, just because we'll talk about things like happiness. We'll talk about things like cleanliness when we delve into the niyamas. But I really like the idea of having a whole practical session maybe after that, where we actually talk about, okay, the yamas are, it's great on paper, it's great in principle, but how do we actually think about applying them in our daily lives? And when we have those things, for example, like just even thoughts, right, that are negative, or thoughts that are not helpful, how should we even at that very basic mental level think about sort of conquering those thoughts, or maybe switching out those negative thoughts for positive thoughts? I think with that, why don't we, table for today, just because we, I think, have given our audience a lot to think about, a lot to sort of internalize and contemplate. But I'll give it back to you, Shriramji, if you have anything else incremental before we close that you'd like to mention on the yamas.
Yeah, thank you, Vedantji. So next week, when we cover the different niyamas, we will address some of the points that you mentioned. For example, how do we handle a thought that says, I want to go against yamas or against niyamas? What are the ways in which we can handle that? And we will also talk about the benefits or the siddhis associated with these different yamas and niyamas. For example, if we live a life of ahimsa, then what is the resulting positive consequence that come out of it? And in the Yoga Sutras, Patanjali enumerates for each of the 5 yamas and each of the 5 niyamas, he gives what is the value, what is the benefit of living that practice. We will cover that also in the next session.
Perfect. And so with that, why don't we go ahead and wrap up for today? So thank you very much, Shriramji, for this very enlightening discussion. I think, coming into the discussion of the yamas, I think for our audience who probably feels this way, there's a lot to, when you read about these definitions, you do your online research, you just look at it online, there's a very sort of literal interpretation, I think, of all these 5 different yamas, right? But when you actually go deeper into it, and you actually try to unpack each of the different yamas, there's so much more, and it's just so much more nuanced. And I think a lot of things also play together. So it goes back to this whole concept of pieces fitting together, as opposed to these being distinct concepts that you sort of live your life with, right? And I think the example goes back to what we discussed earlier about ahimsa and satya, right? Do the two coexist? And often they do. And it's probably unlikely to find yourself in a situation where you'll only be able to play up one versus the other. So I think that's super interesting, and hopefully our audience will have a lot of food for thought to think about post this discussion. And so with that, why don't we go ahead and close up for today? So thank you to our audience for attending the session today. We hope you found it informative and educational in some capacity. And like we discussed, we'll go ahead and hopefully bring up the concept of niyamas in the next session. And we'll try to touch upon more of the practical aspects of how do we actually think about applying these concepts in our daily lives going forward. So with that, thank you very much, everyone. We appreciate it. And we look forward to speaking with you all in the next session going forward.
Thank you all.
Thank you.
Thank you, Vedantji.